The rain pounded the glass with such fury, as if the city itself were trying to wash away the fatigue of the previous day. Outside the windows of the emergency room at Boston's Massachusetts General Hospital, the air was thick with cold moisture and the sound of sirens echoing off the wet asphalt. Nurse Claire Donovan, 29, crossed the threshold of the duty area, shaking the droplets off her hood and not immediately noticing the paramedic on shift nodding tiredly at her. Everything seemed the same as always: the duty lights, the coffee in a plastic cup, the pale faces on the gurneys. Until the moment there was a thud on the door. The ambulances slowed down with a screech. One of them hadn't turned off its headlights, the light shining through the glass, cutting through the darkness. 2 paramedics with soaked shoulders dragged a stretcher inside. On them lay a man, unconscious, with wounds that left no doubt he was on edge. The face was shattered almost beyond recognition. Dirt, blood, burn marks. His shoulder was twisted, and there were shreds of cloth on his chest, soaked in purple moisture. And a detail that was immediately etched in Claire's memory: a metal tag with the initials AS half hidden beneath the torn strap of the unloader. No ID, no phone, no sign of an escort. Only a short report from the paramedic: found by the harbor. No communication. Pulse unstable. Presumably military. Or something like that. There was a pause in the waiting room. One of the doctors on duty froze, looking at the wounded man as if he were a mine without a timer. Someone mumbled, "We don't touch those without a federal marker." The head doctor, Jensen, was already calling for an administrator. The doctors didn't move. The nurses looked at each other. The word federal hung in the air like an alarm. Claire stared at the man on the stretcher and heard no other voices. Only the muffled beeps of the device, which counted down the remaining heartbeats ever more quietly. She stepped forward without authorization. She picked up the sharply disinfected gloves and put them on almost automatically. Slid the gurney over. Someone shouted, "Claire, stop. You're being..." But she was already tilting the patient's head, checking the airway. She whispered to herself rather than to anyone, "If we wait, he won't even make it to failure." Her hands acted faster than her thoughts. She hadn't been trained to work under threat of dismissal, but she had been trained not to let go of those she could still snatch a chance from. The patient's body was convulsing. BP was dropping precipitously. His chest was rising less and less with each passing minute. Claire shouted into the hallway, "Triangle, thoracentesis kit, 2 bags of plasma. Now." The nurse at the post hesitated, then ran. The patient started to lose his pulse. His ribs already looked dead yellow. Blood was seeping through the bandages. Claire ran her hand over his chest, groping for drainage points. The metal from the splinters crunched under her fingers. She worked in absolute silence, only the scraping of tools, the rustle of plastic, the wheeze escaping from her damaged lungs. The first 10 minutes were like a fight in the dark. She couldn't see the patient's face. He was more of a task than a person, and yet he was hers. The pulse disappeared. The monitor gave out a straight line. Without further ado, she picked up the defibrillator. First shock, silence. The second, a faint twitch. The third, a short, almost embarrassed squeak, and then the signal again. Someone in the room exhaled. Claire didn't look at anyone. There was only one thought in her mind: so while her heart was beating. She did the internal stitches, secured the tube to the lung. Her fingers were red to the elbows, but she didn't stop until the IVs started in rhythm with the monitor. The wounded man remained unconscious, but he was no longer dying. It was a victory. Deaf, silent, stubborn. It wasn't until an hour later that she allowed herself to look at him as a human being. Young. About 30 years old. Burn mark on his left cheekbone. Hair cut short. Corps emblem embossed in the leather on his left arm. Marine. Nothing more. Claire took off her gloves and stepped out into the hallway. Someone walked past without looking. Someone shook their head. In the break room, she poured herself some water but couldn't take a sip. At 3 in the morning, the ward came alive again. Another call, new patients, a new routine. And it seemed to her that the night was over. The next morning, when the sky over Boston was rain-washed and seemed strangely peaceful, she received a call to the superintendent's office. Her name was written on the glass of the door, temporarily attached, like everything in this hospital. There was a man waiting outside the door who was supposed to explain everything. Or, on the contrary, to cross it out. The smell of coffee in the superintendent's office was too pungent, almost aggressive, as if trying to break the unbearable silence that hung between the two people. Claire sat on the edge of her chair, feeling the thin fabric of her uniform clinging to her back. Her jacket, soaked from yesterday's rain, hung on a hook by the door, leaving drips on the floor. The superintendent, Dr. Goodman, was flipping through papers, though he seemed to know every word by heart. He didn't look her in the eye. An incoming call flashed in the corner of the computer screen, but he didn't answer it. It was too important to finish a conversation that had already dragged on. He spoke dryly in phrases as if cut from internal regulations. Violation of protocols. Unauthorized intervention. Patient without confirmed identification. Potential threat to institutional security. Behind him were not just lines of rules but people, the administrative board, the insurance system, the legal department, all those who didn't see blood but decided how to dispose of it. Claire didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. Just listened to her name fade away. On the badge, on the timetable, on the electronic badges, nowhere else would she be. Today was the last day. When he was done, she stood up slowly. No pleas, no tears. She walked to the door, picked up her jacket, zipped it up to her chin. Something jingled in the pocket. A tag. Metal, slightly bent. S. 2 letters clutched in her palm like a secret. She wasn't going to leave it behind. And she wasn't going to explain it to anyone. The wounded man she'd rescued during the night had been moved to a separate block under guard in the morning. His name was still being withheld. And the uniform he wore raised more questions than it answered. Was he military? And why the patch on his shoulder was strange, not with a name, not a department, but a set of numbers. 114 to 82. No doctor had given Claire a straight answer. And those who knew something avoided her gaze. On the way out of the hospital, no one said goodbye. Only the guard at the turnstile lowered his eyes as she passed. Claire walked under the morning sun, which seemed to mock her with its brightness after such a night. Her duffel bag hung on her shoulder, light and empty. The house greeted her with silence. A small third-floor apartment with a peeling door and creaky steps. The bathroom still smelled of chlorine. On the table, her forgotten notebook from yesterday and a mug of coffee in which the tape was already floating. She sat down, put the tag on the table and just stared at it. There was no anger, no panic. There was a feeling of emptiness, as if the hospital she'd given 6 years to had kicked her to the curb without warning. The night passed sleeplessly. Anxious but not hysterical. She listened to cars rumbling somewhere below her windows and an old man coughing in the next apartment. She stared at the ceiling, remembering how they had been told in training school, the main thing is not to panic. Panic kills faster than bleeding. She held on. Until morning. Until there was a persistent knock on the door. Not the mailman. Not a neighbor. Not a policeman. 2 men in black suits and a woman in an overcoat stood in the stairwell. Faces neutral, cold. One of them held a thin white envelope. Claire Donovan? One of the men asked without introduction. She nodded. He held out the envelope and stepped back as if running a technical errand. Didn't explain who they were. Didn't give a business card. Only added, "We recommend you read it immediately. The call is urgent." The door closed behind her with a slight slam. She stood with the envelope in her hands, unmoving. The paper was heavy, not from a cheap packet. There was an emblem on the back. Not presidential. Private. Arlington Initiative Foundation. The name didn't tell her anything. Inside is an invitation. Personalized. No explanation, no unnecessary language. Claire Donovan, you're invited to the Foundation's headquarters in Washington, D.C. Departing today. Tickets and coordinates are enclosed. Participation is strictly confidential. Details in person. She reread the letter 3 times. There was no signature. Just a seal. A corporate monogram on blue paper. It was like a passage from a novel, not reality. Outside the window, the city was still bustling, hanging laundry, slamming doors. Anne Claire, yesterday's unemployed nurse, stood with an invitation that had no logic or explanation. All she had now was a 2-letter tag, a strange summons to the Capitol, and a feeling that all she thought she had lost might just be beginning. Claire stood at the massive black gates with wrought iron peaks, behind which stood an old mansion tucked into the shade of trees. Georgetown was no place for random addresses. Here the houses breathed history, and behind every window were names that appeared in news reports. The house she'd been brought to had no sign, no security in sight, or even an American flag. Not a single symbol that said, this was where the government worked. But that was what suggested it was more serious than that. The foyer greeted her with silence and marble coolness. Footsteps on the parquet were muffled by the carpet, which was so detailed that it looked hand-painted. A few minutes later, a woman of about 45 came down from the top floor, her hair checked to the millimeter and a look of poise rather than fatigue. She approached Claire and called herself simply, Mary Shaw. The name sounded without titles or family pride, but there was enough in it to make everything inside freeze. Sh. Like the initials on the metal tag in Claire's pocket. Sh. They walked into a living room with tall windows and heavy curtains. Not a single photograph on the walls. Just old paintings and a wall clock that didn't seem to tick at all. Mary sat her down in a chair and was silent for a long time, as if weighing how far to go. At last she spoke without looking at her companion. She said that the brother Claire had saved was not just a soldier. This is a man whose name hasn't appeared in official databases for a long time. He was part of a closed program that isn't even talked about in military records. And now his return puts many in jeopardy. Claire didn't have time to ask any questions. Mary reached for the remote and turned on a screen built into a panel between the bookcases. Surveillance video from the security camera in the emergency room. That very night. The gurney, the pool of blood, the confused staff, and her Claire, at the center of it, giving commands, acting confidently, quickly, almost on the edge of instinct. The camera from another angle, she sews up the wound with such precision that one of the doctors next to her just stands there and doesn't interfere. Mary paused. Claire's gaze on the screen is focused, hard, almost military. "Did you serve?" Mary asked, and there was no accusation in the question, just a statement. Claire shook her head slowly. "No, I didn't." But her father was an army paramedic, had been through Iraq, taught her everything he knew. They'd spent hours practicing dressings on rubber dummies in the garage, reading manuals, practicing on old army kits. Medical school added uniforms, but the foundation was from him. Mary listened without comment. Only pressed a button and the screen disappeared into the panel. She didn't offer tea. She didn't ask how Claire was feeling. She just said, "What you've done hasn't gone unnoticed. But attention isn't always a reward." Then, as if by the way, Mary opened a folder containing a document, a proposal for a temporary assignment. Not to a hospital. Not to a military unit. But to a medical think tank, technically a private medical center, but working at the intersection of several agencies. They needed someone like Claire. Someone who could do things without being told to. Someone who could ignore fear. She didn't say why. She didn't say who exactly would need to be treated, counseled, or helped. She just added, "You have 24 hours. Then the offer disappears. Just like you disappeared from the hospital's database." Claire could feel the internal tension humming in her temples. This wasn't like restoring justice. This was like recruiting. Only not for a contract, but for something where there was no paper trail. Leaving the mansion, Claire turned around only once. Mary was standing at the window, not waving back. Around her neck was a small chain with a pendant in the shape of a compass. A subtle symbol in a house without a flag. And Claire suddenly realized in this game the compass had long ago gone astray. All that was left was the vector. Forward. The building where Claire now worked looked like a regular government clinic from the outside. Light-colored stone facade, unmarked, no flag displayed, and guards too inconspicuous to be casual. Located on a quiet street near Capitol Hill, it was as if it existed parallel to the official medical system. No website, no appointment schedules, no names on signs. Inside, sterility, order and silence, broken only by the soft hum of ventilation. There were no crowds of patients, no queues or anxious cries. Only privacy, only faces that were kept out of the cameras and out of the reports. From the moment Claire signed the papers, her life was no longer hers. The new badge contained no job title, just initials and access a level above the one the superintendent had in Boston. She got to the daily briefings through the service entrance, where cameras were forbidden to film. Secretaries are silent, guards don't even nod. She's been warned, the patients are special. Some are senators with chronic diagnoses, needing emergency injections right before a vote. Others were ex-military, now working in consulting for the State Department. There were also those who came without a first name, without a last name, with a no questions asked recommendation. She was handed a list not of medications, but of political peculiarities. Who you can't talk to, who you can't make eye contact with, who you can only touch with gloves, even if there are no medical reasons. Claire worked with care. Precise, accurate, but not overly proactive. She didn't argue, didn't express opinions, didn't touch topics that didn't involve blood pressure or pulse. All until one evening when she opened patient number 114-82's electronic chart, hidden under the access level but for some reason now available to her. S is the same initials. Medical history is minimal. Closed head injury, multiple shrapnel wounds, recovery recorded. Date of last checkup is 3 weeks ago. But the emergency contact line was not blank. Under Guardian, Gregory Shaw. The name was self-explanatory. Senator Shaw is a face on billboards, on TV, a presidential candidate, a fighter for a new ethics and a transparent America. And Claire, staring at the monitor, felt the stability under her feet disappear. She connected everything quickly: the name, the initials, the sister, Mary Shaw, the woman in the mansion. But most importantly, the fact that the injured man wasn't hiding from criminals, but from his own family. A few conversations, a couple of opaque hints, and everything became clear. Aidan Shaw, the senator's son, had publicly refused to participate in his father's charitable foundation, where the money came through fictitious organizations and settled in the right hands. He was planning to testify, but he didn't make it. They found him at the docks. Broken, written off as a victim of assault. Too accidental, for a simple accident. Claire no longer felt like a hero. She felt like a pawn. If he was meant to be taken out, then perhaps he had survived not because of her, but against someone else's will. And now she, who had become a symbol of unofficial victory, could be used in someone else's game. Raise it to say the system works. Take her down if she starts asking too many questions. In this clinic, the ladder of success was as smooth as the floorboards beneath her feet. If you stepped off it, you could slide down it very quickly. One afternoon, when the clinic was particularly quiet, Claire was checking on a shipment of medication. Everything was on the list except for one thing: a labeled ampoule she hadn't ordered. She was about to call to clarify when the office door opened without a knock. There he stood on the threshold. His face still pale, but no trace of scars. Short haircut, black sweater, military posture. He held the folder in his hands but didn't hold it out. His gaze was calm, almost indifferent, as if they had never met. But Claire knew him down to the smallest detail, knew how he breathed when he was dying. And he knew who she was. He walked in without waiting for an invitation and closed the door behind him. Not a word. No smile. Just silence. And in it, something subtly dangerous and important. Everything had changed. He came on his own. For the first time. 3 months had passed. Spring in Washington had already changed to a humid, sultry summer. The air in the capital was thick with the smell of lime trees and asphalt heated to a midday sheen. Inside the building that housed the closed congressional clinic, the air conditioners whispered almost inaudibly, maintaining a sterile coolness. Claire Donovan now occupied an office on the 3rd floor, with windows overlooking a small garden where security officers sometimes sat in the shade of trees. Her desk was as clean as an operating table. A clipboard, a duty roster, a box of gloves, and a small photograph of her father, the only personal touch. She worked differently. Listened more, argued less, chose her words precisely. The system she'd been led into was closed and cautious, but Claire had learned to move through it like a maze, calmly, without fuss, as if she wasn't looking for a way out, just exploring the moves. In those 3 months, she'd implemented new emergency protocols, proposed reforms to on-call logistics, and most importantly, started assembling a team of paramedics she trusted. No one knew exactly how she was allowed to do this. But no one asked. She became her own element in someone else's structure. Everything changed one ordinary Tuesday. In the morning, with the sun barely touching the treetops, Claire found a thick envelope on her desk with no stamp or return address. Just her name. The handwriting was stern but not formal. She tore the paper slowly, as if there might be more than just a letter inside. There was. Inside was an old army medal. Shabby, lightly scratched, but neatly cleaned. Claire knew right away it wasn't a government award. It was personal. On the back was engraved text: "You brought me back. Now your voice is my duty." No signature, no name. Only a thin shadow of meaning. There was a note attached to the letter. The paper smelled neither of perfume nor coffee, it smelled of archives, of time. Smooth lines, no embellishments. Aidan Shaw wrote that he had disappeared after his discharge for a reason. He was in protective custody but not guarded, under surveillance. What happened that night at the docks was not an accident, but a planned attempt to eliminate him. He was going to hand over documents and internal reports on how his father was diverting funds aimed at helping veterans through charities to offshore and private foundations. He was the source. He spent 3 years gathering evidence, recording conversations, tweaking transactions so that a digital chain remained. He was going to go to the Ethics Commission. But they beat him to it. If it weren't for Claire, his name would remain in the statistics as robbery victim. His story is like another lost voice. But she did the impossible. She deviated from protocol and broke the system to bring him back to life. After her intervention, the materials did reach him. Through his sister Mary. She referred them to the right committee. An internal congressional investigation has begun. They haven't made it public yet, but things are stirring inside. Several contracts have already been frozen. And Senator Gregory Shaw's name was no longer on the list of presidential candidates. Claire finished the letter slowly as if each word carried weight. There was one more paragraph at the end. Aiden wrote that their mother had once received the medal for saving the wounded in a field hospital in Vietnam. He kept it as a symbol. But now he said it belongs to her. Because heroes aren't the ones who wear the uniform. They're the ones who aren't afraid to act when others are silent. That same evening, Claire sat down at her laptop and opened a draft. She hadn't written a statement. Didn't ask for a transfer. She started registering a foundation. Independent, no big names. No faces. Just an idea, to help medics who were caught between protocol and conscience. Those who were fired for overreacting. Those who put life before resolution. The foundation's name was simple, line 114, after the very number on the AS patch. A month later she no longer wore a robe. No more putting a stethoscope to the chests of ministers and agents. She was collecting stories. Funded scholarships. Sent letters with the short text, "We saw. We believe. Keep going." One evening she walked into a clinic in the capital. No security. Just a bustling emergency room and a nurse in her 20s trying to bring order to the hurricane of night duty. The girl's hands were shaking, unable to get into a vein for a patient with exacerbated asthma. Claire quietly approached, touched her elbow and whispered, slowly, first the breath then the line. The girl turned around, not recognizing it. Just nodded and did the right thing. And Claire walked back out into the night, leaving no trace. That's how someone had once helped her, silently, precisely, and on time. And now she was that someone for others. And that was more important than any position. Dear viewers, thank you for being with us. Subscribe to the channel, like us, and be sure to write in the comments what you think of this story. Don't forget to click on the bell, so you don't miss new interesting stories. See you soon.